Page number 117. Continued. The character writer. Character writing or character is a prose genre, G-E-N-R-E, genre which encouraged pithy and epigrammatic writing rather than elaboration and amplification, and it was cultivated by a number of writers. One of the most popular forms of prose writing was the sermon. Prose was used for science and philosophy, for history and travel, for biography, for diary and letter, for pamphleteering and journalism. On the whole, the movement was towards a simpler, clearer, more logical and more straightforward prose style. The general concern of the new age was intellectual, and both prose and poetry displayed this concern. Drama. The exhaustion of the Renaissance impulse resulted in the drying up of the creative vein, and literature became decadent. End of page 117, now page 118. Drama. The exhaustion of the Renaissance impulse resulted in the drying up of the creative vein, and literature became decadent. The degeneration was best reflected in the drama of the new age. Sensationalism, a morbid preoccupation with disease and death, the exploitation of crude physical horrors and unnatural themes such as incest and growing obscenity and immorality of the plays were all symptoms of this decadence. This degenerate drama died a natural death with the closure of the theatres in the 1640s. The age of French influence. History of the period. It seems a curious contradiction at first glance to place the return of Charles II at the beginning of the modern England, as our historians are wont to do, for there was never a time when the progress of liberty which history records was more plainly turned backwards. The Puritan regime had been too severe, and it had repressed too many natural pleasures. Now, released from restraint, society abandoned the decencies of life and the reverence for law itself, and plunged into excesses more unnatural than had been the restraints of Puritanism. The inevitable effect of excess is disease, and for almost an entire generation following the Restoration in 1660, England lay sick of a fever. Socially, politically, morally, London suggests an Italian city in the days of Medici, and its literature, especially its drama, often seems more like the delirium of illness than the expression of a healthy mind. But even a fever has its advantages. Whatever impurity is in the blood is burnt and purged away, and a man rises from fever with a new strength and a new idea of the value of life, like King Hezekiah, who, after his sickness and fear of death, resolved to go softly all his days. The Restoration was the great crisis in English history, and that England lived through it was due solely to the strength and excellence of that Puritanism which she thought she had flung to the winds when she welcomed back a vicious monarch at Dover. The chief lesson of the Restoration was this, that it showed by awful contrasts the necessity of truth and honesty, and of a strong government of free men, for which the Puritan had stood like a rock in every hour of his rugged history. Though through fever, England came back slowly to health, through gross corruption in society and in the state, England learned that her people were at heart sober, sincere, religious folk, and that their character was naturally too strong to follow after the pleasure and be satisfied. So Puritanism suddenly gained all that it had struggled for, and gained it even in the hour when all seemed lost, when Milton in his sorrow unconsciously portrayed the government of Charles and his cable in this in that tremendous scene of the Council of the Infernal Peers in Pandemonium, plotting the ruin of the world. Of the king and his followers, it is difficult to write temperately. Most of the dramatic literature of the time is atrocious, and we can understand it only as we remember the character of the court and society for which it was written. Unspeakably vile in his private life, the king had no redeeming patriotism, no sense of responsibility to his country for even his public acts. He gave high offices to blackguards, stole from the exchequer like a common thief, played off Catholics and Protestants against each other, disregarding his pledges to both, broke his solemn treaty with the Dutch and with his own ministers, and betrayed his country for French money to spend on his own pleasures. It is useless to paint the dishonor of a court which followed gaily after such a leader. The first Parliament, while it contained some noble and patriotic members, was dominated by young men who remembered the excess of Puritan zeal, but forgot the despotism and injustice which had compelled Puritanism to stand up and assert the manhood of England. These young politicians vied with the king in passing laws for the subjugation of the church and the state, and in their thirst for revenge upon all who had been connected with Cromwell's iron government, once more a wretched formalism, that perpetual danger to the English church, came to the front and exercised authority over the free churches. The House of Lords was largely increased by the creation of hereditary titles and estates for ignoble men and shameless women who had flattered the king's vanity. Even the bench, that last strong refuge of English justice, was corrupted by the appointment of judges like the brutal Jeffreys, whose aim, like that of their royal master, was to get money and to exercise power without personal responsibility. Amid all this dishonor, the foreign influence and authority of Cromwell's strong government vanished like smoke. The valiant little Dutch navy, which swept the English fleet from the sea, and only the thunder of Dutch guns in the Thames under the very windows of London awoke the nation to the realization of how low it had fallen. End of page 118, now page 119. Two considerations must modify our judgment of this disheartening spectacle. First, the king and his court are not England. Though our histories are largely filled with the records of the kings and soldiers, of intrigues and fighting, these no more express the real life of the people than fever and delirium express a normal manhood. Though king and court and high society arouse our disgust or pity, records are not wanting to show that private life in England remained honest and pure even in the worst days of the Restoration. While London society might be entertained by the degenerate poetry of Rochester and the dramas of Dryden and Wycherley, English scholars hailed Milton with delight, and the common people followed Bunyan and Baxter with their tremendous appeal to righteousness and liberty. Second, the king, with all his pretensions to divine right, remained only a figurehead, and the Anglo-Saxon people, when they tire of one figurehead, have always the will and the power to throw it overboard and choose a better one. The country was divided into two political parties: the Whigs, who sought to limit the royal power in the interests of Parliament and the people, and the Tories, who strove to check the growing power of the people in the interests of their hereditary rulers. Both parties, however, were largely devoted to the Anglican Church, and when James II, after 4 years of misrule, attempted to establish a national Catholicism by intrigues which aroused the protest of the Pope as well as of Parliament, then Whigs and Tories, Catholics and Protestants, united in England's last great revolution. The complete and bloodless revolution of 1688, which called William of Orange to the throne, was simply the indication of England's restored health and sanity. It proclaimed that she had not long forgotten and could never again forget the lesson taught to her by Puritanism in its 100 years of struggle and sacrifice. Modern England was firmly established by the Revolution, which was brought about by the excesses of the Restoration. Literary characteristics. In the literature of the Restoration, we note a sudden breaking away from old standards, just as society broke away from the restraints of Puritanism. Many of the literary men had been driven out of England with Charles and his court, or else had followed their patrons into exile in the days of the Commonwealth. On their return, they renounced old ideals and demanded that English poetry and drama should follow the style which they had become accustomed to in the gaiety of Paris. We read with astonishment in Pepys' diary, 1660 to 69, that he had been to see a play called Midsummer Night's Dream, but that he will never go again to hear Shakespeare, for it is the most insipid, ridiculous play that I ever saw in my life. And again we read in the diary of Evelyn, another writer who reflects with wonderful accuracy the life and spirit of the Restoration. I saw Hamlet played, but how the old plays begin to disgust this refined age, since His Majesty's being so long abroad, since Shakespeare and Elizabethans were no longer interesting. Literary men began to imitate the French writers with whose works they had just grown familiar, and here begins the so-called period of French influence, which shows itself in English literature for the next century, instead of the Italian influence which had been dominant since Spenser and the Elizabethans. One has to consider for a moment the French writers of this period: Pascal, Bossuet, Fenelon, Malherbe, Corneille, Racine, Molière, all the brilliant company which makes the reign of Louis XIV the Elizabethan age of French literature, to see how far astray the early writers of the Restoration went in their wretched imitation. When a man takes another for his model, he should copy virtues, not vices, but unfortunately many English writers reverse the rule, copying the vices of French comedy without any of its wit or delicacy or abundant ideas. The poems of Rochester, the plays of Dryden, Wycherley, Congreve, Vanberg, and Farquhar, all popular in their day, was mostly unreadable. Milton's Son of Belial, flown with insolence and wine, is a good expression of the wild character of the court writers and of the London theatres for 30 years following the Restoration. Such work can never satisfy a people, and when Jeremy Collier in 1698 published a vigorous attack upon the evil plays and the playwrights of the day, all London, tired of the coarseness and excesses of the Restoration, joined the literary revolution, and the corrupt drama was driven from the stage. End of page 119. Now page 120. With the final rejection of Restoration drama, we reach a crisis in the history of literature. The old Elizabethan spirit, with its patriotism, its creative vigor, its love of romance, and the Puritan spirit, with its moral earnestness and individualism, were both things of the past. Dryden, the greatest writer of the age, voiced a general complaint when he said that in his prose and poetry he was drawing the outlines of a new art, but had no teacher to instruct him. But literature is a progressive art, and soon the writers of the age developed two marked tendencies of their own: the tendency of realism and the tendency to the preciseness and elegance of expression which marks our literature for the next 100 years. In realism, that is, the representation of men exactly as they are, the expression of the plain, unvarnished truth, without regard to the ideals of romance, the tendency was first thoroughly bad. The early Restoration writers sought to paint realistic pictures of a corrupt court and society, and as we have suggested, they emphasized vices rather than virtues and gave us coarse, low plays without interest or moral significance. Like Hobbes, they saw the externals of man, his body and appetites, not his soul and his ideals, and so, like most realists, they resemble a man lost in the woods who wanders aimlessly around in circles, seeing the confusing trees but never the whole forest, and who seldom thinks of climbing the nearest high hill to get his bearings. Later, however, this tendency to realism became more wholesome. While it neglected romantic poetry, in which youth is eternally interested, it led to a keener study of the practical motives which govern human action. The second tendency of the age was towards directness and simplicity of expression, and to this excellent tendency our literature is greatly indebted. In both the Elizabethan and Puritan ages, the general tendency of writers was towards extravagance of thought and language. Sentences were often involved and loaded with Latin quotations and classical allusions. The Restoration writers opposed this vigorously. From France, they brought back the tendency to regard established rules for writing, to emphasize close reasoning rather than romantic fancy, and to use short, clean-cut sentences without any unnecessary word. We see this French influence in the Royal Society, which had for one of its objects the reform of English prose by getting rid of its swellings of style, and which bound all its members to its use, a close, naked, natural way of speaking, as natural to mathematical plainness as they can. Dryden accepted this excellent rule for his prose and adopted the heroic couplet as the next best thing for the greater part of his poetry, as he tells us himself, and to this unpolished, rugged verse I chose as fittest for discourse and nearest prose. It is largely due to him that the writers developed that formalism of style, that precise, almost mathematical elegance, miscalled classicism, which ruled English literature for the next century. Another thing which the reader will note with interest in Restoration literature is the adoption of the heroic couplet, that is, two iambic pentameter lines which rhyme together as the most suitable form of poetry. Waller, who began to use it in 1623, is generally regarded as the father of the couplet, for he is the first poet to use it consistently in the bulk of his poetry. Chaucer had used the rimmed couplet wonderfully well in his Canterbury Tales, but in Chaucer it is the poetical thought more than the expression which delights us. With the Restoration, writers form counts for everything. Waller and Dryden made the couplet the prevailing literary fashion, and in their hands the couplet became closed. That is, each pair of lines must contain a complete thought, stated as precisely as possible. Thus Waller writes, "The soul's dark cottage, battered and decayed, lets in new light through chinks that time has made." That is a kind of aphorism such as Pope made in large quantities in the following age. It contains a thought, it's catchy, quotable, easy to remember, and the Restoration writers delighted in it. Soon this mechanical closed couplet, in which the second line was often made first, almost excluded all other forms of poetry. It was dominant in England for a full century, and we have grown familiar with it and somewhat weary of its monotony in such famous poems as the Pope's Essay on Man and Goldsmith's Deserted Village. These, however, are essays rather than poems. That even the couplet is capable of melody and even character shown, and the variety is shown in Chaucer's Tales and Keats' Endymion. End of page 120, now page 121. These four things, the tendency to vulgar realism in the drama, a general formalism which came from following set rules, the development of a simpler and more direct prose style, and the prevalence of the heroic couplet in poetry are the main characteristics of Restoration literature. They are all exemplified in the work of one man, John Dryden.